Thank you for having me. I'm not an artist or a designer, but I can talk a little bit about what at least STS and anthropology by other means have meant for me, and by something that gets kind of folded into, sometimes gets called art, which would be drawing. So I come to this topic through experiments I've begun recently in drawing to figure out some concepts that I'm working through, which most immediately have to do with breathing and with the potential and challenges of figuring shared conditions, always unequal, of living in atmospheres, in living in atmospheric suspension. It's something that at other times I call a conspiracy. Right? Conspiracy meaning a breathing together, along with other things, right? So I'm less interested in thinking about drawing in the kind of representation or fabrication question that's put in motion by the experiments I've been doing than I am in the question of what drawing as a practice or a mode of attention or study and as a medium for rendering, arranging, or abstracting might offer as a method for ethnographic or conceptual making. And equally, we might ask what's required or made possible or foreclosed in a practice of sketchy thought. So the current project I'm working on is called Drawing Breath Together, a conspiracy catalog, which is you might think of it as a work of speculative ecological thinking, which is asking about a possible ethics of atmospheric conspiracy, a commitment to breathing together from and in an unequally shared medium, an unevenly constituted planetary milieu for respiration where concentrations of well and unwell being accumulate differentially, sometimes quickly and sometimes slowly. The political problem of reckoning with being together in atmospheres, with the possibilities and impossibilities of breathing with, in late industrial, racialized, and engineered worlds might be posed in this way. What conditions the differential distributions of the difficulties or impossibilities of breath for particular forms of life? It is hard to breathe in many places, in some places more than others, for some bodies more than others. And so what would it take? What would it mean and what would it do to face the conditions of distribution where I inhale the cough or choke of another? So this is, in other words, a kind of problem of how to think or feel, or think and feel in atmospheric subjectivity and co-implication. It begins with this. This graph is a graph of cost meeting demand and a graph of the difference between the personal cost or apparent cost and the social cost or real cost. This is something you would get in Environmental Economics 1 if you were studying this in university. I don't have time to go through the graph in depth, but I will say that it basically, this graph is used to represent what's called an environmental externality, right? Which some of you might know is what is called the costs that are not being paid when the pricing of something does not reflect the true cost of its production, right? Or not just its production, but say the true cost of the medical costs that accrue after a particular thing is made, right? And so what happens in the course of studying an environmental externality is, in a longer version of this, I would talk about a person who's like using the chalk to sort of trace in this triangle, which is the cost that's not being paid. If the cost of something is not being priced to meet, to reflect the true, if the price of something's not being priced to reflect the true cost, right? So I first encountered this actually in university, and so the lecturer said, so here's the real cost. So who pays this cost? No one's paying this cost, right? He says, but actually, people do pay this. There are payers of this cost, and as he chalked it in, he said, breathers pay, right? Breathers like breathing, right? And the idea of this, of course, is that it is a kind of abstracted social cost of all the people, and maybe all the animals or all the ecologies that are in the vicinity of, say, a smokestack or something, who are paying the unpaid costs of a particular commodity's production. So I've been worrying over the breathers for a long time, right? I've been thinking with the breathers, and I've been working through the project I'm working on now is kind of motivated or structured by I kind of have three ways I work. One is an image, something I sort of imagine as the museum, what I call the Museum of Breathers. A slogan, which is Breathers Conspire. Imagine it like, breathers conspire, right? And a practice, which is what I call drawing breath together. I'll just leave this while I talk a bit about the drawing. So the practice of drawing different sorts of figures on the same page or in the same frame or something is motivated by the museum and the slogan. And it kind of, for me, at least, I work in English, and so the phrase drawing breath together draws together a lot of different meanings, right? There is the kind of drawing breath, which is the inhaling, right? There is drawing, right, which would be, this kind of drawing. But in English, drawing would also mean something like, to pull or to extract, right? To draw something out. And drawing together is something like, you could draw things together. You could also, you can bring them together, right? To collect them. And the part of the reason I began to draw was I wanted to, in earlier writing, I had sort of tried to work through the concept of the breather, and tried to think about, the question of who is not a breather, right? And what kind of political potential is there for a kind of undifferentiated subject, which is actually highly differentiated, right? Like if you sort of think about the conditions of breath and well and unwell being, they're highly stratified and highly they're highly different, right? And yet it is this like highly universalizing term at the same time, right? And so so the drawing was a response to responses I would get when I would present work on this to anthropology audiences, whose first response would always be, well, not everyone breathes the same, right? And I would say, well, yeah, that's the point, And so what I wanted to do, both for them and also in a response to that triangle from the that represents the breathers for the environmental externality, was to populate that triangle, was to smush into and flesh and to materialize as much as I could into that space, right? So that what you had as an abstraction was not a thinning out of the world, but a kind of density, right? A sort of densification, a population of the concept. How long have I talked? Okay, I'm going to skip lots of things. So I began to draw things, right? And part of drawing has been a way of paying attention to things and to try to find things specific to a kind of atmospheric condition that can be worked up into a kind of like depending on the audience, I call it a theory, or a sort of like a possible kind of a social theory that is adequate or proper to an atmospheric condition. But you might also, at other times, I've called it a poetics, right? How do you build a kind of idiom, or not an idiom? How do you build a kind of principle of composition of language for a kind of thinking that would reach for both a kind of rendering of current conditions and also sort of potential political otherwises. These are some of the terms I think with. And one thing, I'll just show this. think part of what I'm doing in drawing these things, right, is trying to find a way to build abstractions that are coming from sort of selections of detail, right? So something like an abstraction that is highly specific rather than general. And I suppose, you know, part of it is the other thing I think that I'm responding to. I haven't given much thought to it, right? Although, like, this is a good opportunity for me to try to think about why I've been doing it or what I get out of it. I think I'm also responding to the the kind of highly visual, the highly invulnerable forms of scientific visualization of various kinds of atmospheric problems. Right, and so this, in a way, is a kind of embracing of a kind of bad image, right? Bad in relationship to a digital visualization, bad in relationship to a photo, bad in relationship to a kind of social documentation that would be, you know, the sort of typical purview of an anthropology or sociology. It's also a kind of embrace of, actually, Nina, I appreciated your comments because it helped me give me some language for thinking about it. I think it's also both scary and I think I still stubbornly stick to it because it leaves me highly vulnerable in a kind of, these images don't really help you say anything useful with any kind of utility in either environmental politics spaces or in STS or anthropology spaces. So rather stubbornly, I've sort of developed a mode that makes me not useful for much. But I've been teaching it anyway to my students. And so here's an example of what I've been doing in a class recently that I called STS in Anthropology of an As Composition, which was I asked students to make a bad drawing, make a doodle from the world that they were researching or that they were studying, and then to make a bad poem based on their doodle. Right? And so what I tried to teach this as was to think about drawing and the selection of both the selection of you know, we would call it an object, but like artists would probably call it their subject, right? The selection of something to draw as a kind of first step in ethnographic attention, and selections of detail and selections of particular lines to follow or particular aspects of it to inscribe as being a kind of ethnographic attention. And then ethnographic writing would be then a kind of, and ethnographic concept making also would be a practice of following the movement and making gestures that have some fidelity to what and how you attended to an object. And where you are both tied to the thing that you are, you know, making something, you know, drawing from, but also trying to make a gesture that can connect or open to somewhere else. So I'll end there. All right, thanks.